So now we're going to do something completely different and look at Job 28. The wisdom poem of Job 28. All right, now as I've indicated, I believe that this is the structural center of the book of Job. And it basically functions with the analogy of mining for gold and jewels in comparison to acquiring wisdom. It begins, in verse 1, surely there is a mine for silver and a place for gold that they refine. Iron is taken out of the earth and copper is smelted from the ore. Man puts an end to darkness and searches out the farthest limit, the ore in gloom and deep darkness. Now, the analogy of comparing mining to finding wisdom seems to me to be especially well done. Because, of course, mining is something that you have to search. It involves searching for something and diligently digging it out. You work really, really hard to get to something that lies hidden until you can obtain it. And the analogy, of course, is wisdom, that you would work really, really hard in order to find it and get it to yourself. Often wisdom is compared to gold and jewels and declared to be of greater value than gold and jewels, and that also works with this analogy. But notice again in verse 3, man puts an end to darkness. Now in the analogy, that's like tunneling in the earth and going down there with a lamp and bringing light into the dark places of the earth. In terms of the metaphor, it is finding wisdom. It is shining light upon what otherwise is dark and obscure. So I'm just pointing out that I believe this is an extremely well-crafted poem, and its choice of an analogy is very well done. And so it then gives this extended portrayal of what human beings do. They dig a shaft in the valley. They dig way down. They get to where, verse 6, there are sapphires and gold. And then verses 7 and 8, it's a path that no bird of prey knows, and the falcon's eye have not seen it. The proud beasts have not trodden it. The lion has not passed over it. Well, I mean, it seems obvious, if you're talking about mining, that falcons and eagles have no interest in mining as they fly around up in the air. For that matter, neither would lions. Views of wisdom, however, it is interesting because wisdom texts often will refer to animals as being examples of a kind of wisdom. If you turn very quickly to Proverbs chapter 30, Proverbs 30. You can see places where animals have been referenced as exemplars of wisdom. So we read in chapter 30, let's see. For example, verse 24, 4 things on earth are small, but they are exceedingly wise. The ants are a people not strong, yet they provide for their food in summer. The rock badgers are people not mighty, yet they make their homes in cliffs. The locusts have no king, all of them march in ranks. Lizard you can take in your hand, but it is in kings' palaces. And then notice also in verses 29 and 30, 3 things are stately in their tread, 4 are stately in their tread, 4 are stately in their stride. First, the lion, which is the mightiest among beasts. And notice back in Job that here, in this reference to wisdom here, the lion knows nothing of this wisdom. So that's significant, and it points us to the direction that this poem is going to take. He continues with his analogy in verses 9 to 11. People work very hard. They put their hand in the ESV, to the flinty rock. You know, rock that is so hard it's almost painful to touch. So it is hard work. And they cut channels in the rocks in order to bring up wisdom. So verses 1 to 11 is the analogy. I guess I should lay out the outline. Verses 1 to 11 is the analogy to mining. Analogy to mining. Verses 1 to 11. Then you have verses 12 to 22, which basically say, where is wisdom? Wisdom cannot be found. Verse 12, but where shall wisdom be found? Where is the place of understanding? Man does not know its worth, and it's not found in the hand of the living. The deep says it's not in me. The sea says it's not with me. It cannot be bought for gold. Silver cannot be weighed as its price. So it goes on, it talks about how no amount of money you can give for it will enable you to obtain it. Verse 20, from where then does wisdom come? Where is the place of understanding? It's hidden from the eyes of all living and concealed from the birds of the air. Abaddon and death say, we have heard a rumor of it with our ears. So the second part is wisdom is impossible to find. No one knows where it is. And this is verses 12 to 22. There's one point in the translation, though, that I would probably differ a little bit. Verse 13, the beginning of the verse, the ESV says, man does not know its worth. I would translate it, man does not know how to assess it. The implication of saying man does not know its worth is that people could find wisdom, but they just don't value it enough to make the effort. In my opinion, that's not what the word here means. I think it means people cannot find this wisdom no matter what because they have no frame of reference for it. And that's why I translate it, man does not know how to assess it. I should give you a little bit of an excursus on this. The word that is important here is the root in Hebrew, ngain. For those of you who know Hebrew, good. For those of you who don't worry about it. Ngain, resh, kaf, ngarak. And in context, it is the noun ngarik, like so. Ngarik, which would be rendered in Roman letters something like ngarik. That means ngarik. But the basic idea of the root is to arrange, to set something in order. And from that, it can mean to compare, or it can mean to value something. I think the idea here is setting in order, setting up an arrangement, putting things into their proper place. And it basically, again, as I've translated, connotes not that you just don't value it. You know, you see wisdom, but you just don't care. It's rather, you have no frame of reference for dealing with it. You cannot it's so far beyond your comprehension, you don't know what to do with it. It is utterly above you. Again, the idea of arranging or comparing or assessing, it's the idea that you can have things and you can sort of lay them out on a table and say, okay, I know what this is, and I know what that is, and I know what that is. I can put together a kind of logical arrangement for it. I can describe what each is worth. But this wisdom is something I can't even comprehend. It is so, I don't even know what to do with it. It's just beyond me. So I think that's really what it means, that this is a wisdom which is simply utterly beyond us. So a little different from the ESV at that point. I do not think, therefore, that what the poem is saying is men ought to find this wisdom, but because of indifference, they don't. Rather, I think this passage is saying, this wisdom is so far beyond us, it's hopeless to find it. And again, I think that's what we have here in the verses we just quickly looked over, verses 12 to 22. Wherever you look, it's not there. You don't know where to look for it. You go to the deep, it's not there. You try to buy it with money, you can't buy it. The natural world, the eagles and so forth, they have no idea about it. You even go things that are beyond this earth, Abaddon and death. You know, you're getting into the world beyond this life. And they say, well, we've heard a rumor of it. So this is something that is really, really concealed. It is very difficult for any human to find. So again, consequently, I don't think we should read this as condemning people for knowing this wisdom or for having it available to them and rejecting it. They just have no possible way of obtaining it or finding it. The third part of the text that I'm quickly going to look at, then we're going to do some more assessment of the passage, is verses 23 to 28, which speaks of God's knowledge of this wisdom. God and wisdom. And this is verses 23 to 28. Now, I'm going to look at this in detail in just a moment, but we'll quickly refer to it in the ESV. Verse 23, God understands the way to it. He knows its place, for he looks to the end of earth, sees everything under heaven. And then it goes on, describes the waters and the winds and so forth. We'll look at that in more detail in a moment. Verse 28, and he said to man, behold, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, to turn away from evil is understanding. So God alone knows the way to this wisdom. It is God. No one else can find it. No one else can ever obtain it except God. Now we're going to look at that part of the passage, as I said, in a moment in more detail, but I want us now for a moment to consider what is wisdom in the Bible. What is wisdom in the Bible? First, wisdom can be simply skill or intelligence. Skill or intelligence. It can even be craftiness. Very common example in Exodus 31:6. God gives to Aholiab of the tribe of Dan the wisdom of a skillful craftsman. So this is a wisdom which is the ability to build things. The ability to work with wood or work with gold or work with leather, to work with fabric. You know, handcrafts, being very skillful at some job is a form of wisdom. So to use the word and put it into our modern day, a person who knows how to repair automobiles has that kind of wisdom. A person who has great knowledge of American history has that wisdom. You know, a person who knows how to program a computer has that wisdom. So it's just a skill, a knowledge, an ability. in that sense. Second, wisdom can be specifically moral or theological. And this is much closer to the English use of the word wise or wisdom. If we say he's a really wise man, we rarely would mean he's a great computer programmer or anything like that. We would almost always mean it in a moral sense. He can give guidance in how to live your life. He understands right and wrong. He knows what behavior is likely to bring you harm and what behavior is likely to do you good. And within a Christian or theological setting, deep understanding of the ways of God, deep understanding of the Bible and of Christian doctrine, and so forth. So this is fairly universal in the book of Proverbs, where wisdom always refers to the second sense of moral and theological understanding. The third level of wisdom, and we're going to go back to 2 and contrast 2 and 3 in a moment, but the third is what we could simply call the inner thoughts of God, or how people should think regarding the thoughts of God. So this third level of wisdom is, as I've suggested, this is what we have in Job 28. It is the plan of God, the mind of God, the intention of God. It is hidden inside God's mind. It is God knowing what He is doing in the world. And by definition, only God knows. You can remember, for example, when Jesus was asked by the disciples, when will all these things be fulfilled? His answer was, neither the angel of heaven, what is it? Can't remember it exactly, but only the Father knows these things. Right? Only God knows when human history will come to an end. Only God knows how He is managing all the affairs of the world. So there are these deep inner thoughts in the mind and the plan of God that we do not know and cannot know. But, and it's the alternative here, how people should think regarding the thoughts of God. How should we then respond when there's this area of wisdom we do not know? We should respond the way verse 28 says, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom. To turn away from evil is understanding. So we should respond with trust in God, submission to God, faith in God, continuing fidelity to God, persevering in doing what is right. When we don't know what God is doing, we persevere in doing what is right and in faithfulness to Him. Now, as I said, I'm going to look at this last section of the poem in more detail in a moment, but I want to draw out a very important contrast. And that is the second kind of wisdom, moral and theological, from the third kind. And as I said, the second kind of wisdom is really what the book of Proverbs is all about. And the two are really quite distinct. Where is wisdom according to the book of Proverbs? She is out on the street. Proverbs chapter 1, Lady Wisdom is in the marketplace. She's standing up on a podium. She's shouting at the top of her lungs. People pass by and she tries to grab them and get their attention. She is self-evident. She is everywhere. Same thing when wisdom speaks in Proverbs chapter 8. There is nothing hidden or inaccessible about her at all. You can see her in action when you just look at the world around you. And I've referred to this already, but to remind you, simple examples like the lazy man. You see a person who sleeps all day, who doesn't do his work, who doesn't mend his fences, who doesn't take care of his house and his field. You know he's going to fall into poverty because you've seen it so many times before. This wisdom is right in front of your face. In fact, it is so evident, it is so obvious within the created world, you see it in the animals. So we looked at the examples from Proverbs 30. Rock badgers have enough sense to put their home in a place where they're safe. Ants have enough wisdom to store up food for the winter. So it is a wisdom that even animals possess. There's nothing hidden about it at all. Self-evident. By contrast, in Job 28, you can dig as deep as you want. You can go to the bottom of the sea. You can go and ask Abaddon and death. You can talk to the animals. You can try to buy it. You will not find it. So it is beyond your reach. Now, before I explore verses 20 to 28 in a little more detail, let me, as another excursus, a little side, deal with something which has been a problem or a debate within the church for a long, long time, nearly 2 millennia, nearly from the beginning. In 1 Corinthians chapter 1, Paul speaks of the wisdom of God. And Paul says, 1 Corinthians 1:17, "For Christ did not send me to baptize, but to preach the gospel, and not with words of eloquent wisdom, lest the cross of Christ be emptied of its power. For the word of the cross is folly to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved it is the power of God. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, the discernment of the discerning I will thwart. Where is the one who is wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God the world did not know God through wisdom, it pleased God through the folly of what we preach to save those who believe. For Jews demand signs and Greeks seek wisdom. But we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to the Jews and folly to the Gentiles, but to those who are called both Jews and Greeks, Christ the power of God and the wisdom of God. For the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men." So there you have it, Christ, the wisdom of God. From very early in the church, the question was raised, is Lady Wisdom of Proverbs chapter 8 in fact the Logos, the pre-incarnate Christ, the second person of the Trinity? Because people looked at 1 Corinthians 1 and they said, well, right there, Christ, the wisdom of God. And here we have this portrayal of the wisdom of God, or wisdom, Lady Wisdom, in Proverbs chapter 8. In fact, let's look at that very quickly. Turn to Proverbs chapter 8. Where we read, verse 1, does not wisdom call? Does not understanding raise her voice? And as I just said, verse 2, on the heights beside the way at the crossroads, she takes her stand, and going on, she calls out to people. And she speaks of how she utters truth, and she dwells with prudence, and by her rulers govern justly, and riches and honor are with her, that she walks in the way of righteousness. And she then speaks of how she was present with God at the creation. Now, the ESV translates verse 22, "The Lord possessed me as the beginning of His work, the first of His acts of old." That's a possible translation, but it could equally well be translated, "The Lord created me at the beginning of His work." Why did they translate it as possessed? Well, I don't know. I wasn't on the committee, but I'm going to guess because they were familiar with a very ancient controversy in the church. Again, that is that Lady Wisdom is in fact the Logos, the second person of the Trinity. Well, you're aware of the fact that in the early church there were controversies concerning Christology. Perhaps the most important, desperate, climactic controversy was the Arian heresy. And the Arians denied the deity of Christ. They said that Christ is a created being. He is, in effect, an angel. He is not God. He was incarnate, but he was essentially an incarnate angel. It had already become kind of a fixture in the church that Proverbs 8 was a statement about the Logos, the pre-incarnate Christ. The Arians looked at that and said, well, yeah, no doubt about it. This is the Logos. This is Christ before His incarnation. And it says right here, "The Lord created me at the beginning of His work." And so the Arians had a very strong case. Athanasius actually wrote a very complex and, in my opinion, not persuasive refutation of the Arians, in which he tried to hold on to the traditional view that Proverbs chapter 8 refers to Christ, but it doesn't deny that Christ is eternal God. In my opinion, 1 Corinthians 1, calling Christ the wisdom of God, should not be linked to Proverbs 8. Even apart from those Christological considerations about the deity of Christ and so forth, think about how Paul describes the wisdom of God in 1 Corinthians 1. It is counterintuitive. It is strange. It is folly. It makes no sense. It seems irrational. And of course, what is this wisdom of God that seems to be folly, counterintuitive, irrational? It is the cross. It is the idea that God would deal with evil through the cross. When you look at Lady Wisdom in Proverbs chapter 8, she is anything but counterintuitive. She is as intuitive as she can be. Again, if you're lazy, you'll fall into poverty. If you're a drunkard, you'll ruin your life. If you're violent, you will come to a violent end. There's nothing counterintuitive or mysterious or strange about any of this. Lady Wisdom is in a great degree just common sense. Whereas the Christ, the wisdom of God, which is folly to men, has nothing commonsensical about it at all. It is the hidden wisdom of God. So if you want to look for the wisdom of God in the Old Testament that corresponds to Christ, the wisdom of God in 1 Corinthians 1, it is not Proverbs 8, it is Job 28. It is a wisdom that no human being could fathom. is beyond human understanding, beyond any reach of our knowledge. Nobody could have investigated and thought and said, you know, I bet here's how God's going to deal with evil. He's going to take on human flesh, He's going to become incarnate, and He's going to speak the truth and people will kill Him. That'll do it. No one would think that. It is totally contrary to human wisdom and understanding. It is folly. But it is the folly, the wisdom, the folly of God is wiser than the wisdom of man. It is too deep for us. It is of a category we cannot comprehend. Now, along this line, I do want to show or point out how someone might think of Proverbs 28 and the wisdom, Job 28 and the wisdom of Proverbs as being one and the same. Proverbs chapter 1, verse 7, very, very wonderful verse. Kind of my key verse, the verse I always give to people when I sign a book or something. Proverbs 1:7, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and understanding. And sometimes in various passages it's rendered, for the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. So you got the fear of the Lord that is the beginning of wisdom according to Proverbs. You go back to Job 28 and it seems to be just exactly the same thing. Behold, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom. Well, it's not really the same thing. It's obviously closely related, but different. When you say the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom in Proverbs, what you mean is there is a whole realm of moral and theological truth out there that primarily concerns how we should live our lives. And if you begin with the fear of the Lord, you can come to understand a huge amount. If you start out by saying, God is first, God is the maker and creator, and we must obey Him, then everything else that you investigate as you learn wisdom and you acquire wisdom and you study Proverbs and you become wiser and wiser, it's just all that easy. It's all the more easy because you've begun with knowing God. When you come to Job 28, it's not the beginning of wisdom, it's the whole thing. And again, it's referring, I believe, to the fact that there is a hidden wisdom of God that you cannot understand. It is beyond you. For you, then, the whole thing, all you can do is fear God. Fearing God does not mean you suddenly know the secrets of God. It just means that you acknowledge God knows things that you don't know. God is doing things that you don't necessarily understand. God's ways are above your ways, but you're going to trust Him and believe Him and let Him do what He's going to do. And you're going to maintain your fidelity to Him even in the face of things that to you are inscrutable and sometimes painful. So in fact, even though they both speak of the fear of the Lord, Job 28 and Proverbs 1:7 are really describing, in my opinion, two different issues. Again, Proverbs is the wisdom you can acquire, you can master. And by the fear of the God you master, by fear of God, you master it all the more quickly. The wisdom of Job 28 is a wisdom you will never acquire. You will never know everything that God is doing. But you can respond by fearing God and turning away from evil. Now, I want to say a little bit about Job 28, 20 to 28, where it speaks of God and His wisdom. And for the most part, it's self-evident. But again, I want to point out where I would translate it a little differently because I think the point is not as it is often taken to be. In the ESV, beginning in, let's start in verse 23. God understands the way to it. He knows its place. For he looks to the ends of the earth. He sees everything under heaven. And then in verse 25 in the ESV it says, when he gave the wind its weight and apportioned waters by measure, when he made a decree for the sun and a way for the lightning of the thunder. Well, what does that refer to? It's all past tense, and it would refer to God in creation. When God created the world, just a moment, when God created the world, He, so to speak, made wisdom, which sounds very much like Proverbs 8. And I'm going to suggest to you that I don't think that translation is quite right, that it's actually different. But before I do, go ahead.
Yeah, I had a question on Proverbs 2:6, which seems to say that God is the one who's giving wisdom in Proverbs.
Yeah, I mean, God does give wisdom, but God can give wisdom in terms of He shows you how you should live. He teaches right from wrong. He gives all kinds of instruction regarding, your duty as a human being. It doesn't mean God tells you all of His inner secrets. I mean, there are things God does that He doesn't tell you. So I don't think that's a problem. Okay? Where are we? Back in verse 25. First of all, let me just read to you how I would translate it. Well, I'll start in verse 24. Whenever He looks to the ends of the earth, whenever He observes everything under heaven, to make pressure for the wind, literally that's weight for the wind, but to make pressure for the wind, what we would call air pressure. When He allocates water in measure, when He does it to apportion rain, and to direct thunderous lightning, then He sees it and enumerates it, He fixes it, and even explores it. Now, without my writing it all down yet, I will if you want me to, but what's the point of what I'm saying here in my translation of verses 25 and 26? As I read these texts, they are present tense, and they are referring specifically not to creation, but to the weather. Notice again in verse 25, literally to make weight for the wind, but it is to give pressure to the wind, I think. That is air pressure, moving the air around. Allocating water in measure, doing it to apportion rain. In other words, He puts water in the atmosphere. He does it to bring down rain. And to direct thunderous lightning. These are not things God did once at the beginning of creation. These are things God does every day. So it is God's, in my opinion, it is God's ongoing activity, not His once-for-all creation, that is the point here. And in addition, I would point out to you, in the metaphor, notice what he is referring to. He refers to wind and water. Wind and water are two things that by nature, from the human standpoint, are very difficult to control. Right? They tend to just go all over the place. You can't just pick it up and move it like a rock. And so you have these fluid entities, wind and water, and God is constantly directing them. What is the implication here? What's the point of this metaphor? In my opinion, it's not saying, well, God once made the world and that shows how wise He is. It's that the world is full of chaotic forces and God is managing them all. There's all kinds of things happening in this world. And God is supervising it all, and He's doing it for His own purposes. Why does God send the wind to this place and not to that place? Why does He send a drought here and a nice rain there and a flood there? He's managing the weather conditions throughout the world for His own reasons and for His own purposes. It's something only He can do. But it is something we really can never know for sure why He does it. And then if you just go beyond the image of wind and water, you have just all the chaotic forces that are throughout the world, which is what we're going to see a lot of in God's speech in Job 38 and 39. But you have all kinds of life, you have all kinds of forces, you have wild animals, and then you have people with all their wants and desires and needs and greeds and sins and all that stuff. A really chaotic world. And God is managing the whole thing. But what He's doing, why He's doing it, how He's doing it, what His plan is, how it's going to work out, that's beyond us. We cannot figure that out. So as I read Job chapter 28, what I get from this passage is that there is a high wisdom of God that we cannot that we cannot obtain, that it is beyond us, but that we respond just by faithfully persevering and trusting in God. Just a moment. That will be very, very important, of course, for where the book goes from here. Because as far as Job has been concerned, the only issue is the doctrine of retribution. God punishes sinners, God rewards the righteous. Yet I am righteous, and God has punished me, so I've got to somehow haul God into court to prove that I am righteous and that He shouldn't have punished me, when in fact, God is doing things that Job just doesn't understand. It has nothing to do with guilt. It has nothing to do with Job being a sinner. It is something that is utterly beyond that, but it's something that is simply not revealed to Job. Go ahead.
So would you say, like in the last section of this chapter, he ends with it, verse 28, he says, and after all this, and he said to man, behold, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom. Is this point, God is in His infinite wisdom controlling all of these things, but He doesn't explain to us how He does all these things or why. Out of all of that wisdom that He has, all that He's revealed to us is fear the Lord.
Basically, yes. I would say that's it. And in a broader sense, I'm writing this Old Testament theology, this book I'm writing, and a great part of it is a distinction between the historical / temporal and the eschatological. Eschatological really doesn't necessarily mean at the end of the world, as I understand it, and as I use it, though a lot of it is at the end of the world. It really means a direct act of God. It is God acting. So that the cross is an eschatological event. It is God acting to deal with sin, right? And so, on a historical level, and in dealing with the affairs of this life, we can acquire wisdom. That's Proverbs, the whole book of Proverbs, Proverbs 8. It's built into creation. It's everywhere we look, and especially if we have the fear of God, we can acquire that wisdom. But in terms of God's eschatological purposes, all we can do is trust God. He's going to do it the right way. He'll take care of it all. And if things look wrong to us, well, we just have to trust that God knows what He's doing. So that's the distinction I'm making. And I should add, the eschatological, historical eschatological, again, as I just said, the great eschatological act is the cross. And it is the great act of the hidden wisdom of God, a wisdom we could not have imagined or predicted. Okay? All right, let's see. Do we have anything else to say on this topic? I would note that, as far as I can see, the debate between Job and the three is terminated. Job then in chapter 29 to 31, will make a speech. I think that speech is more directed at God. It doesn't seem to be directed at the three. And so we have this first major section of the book, chapters 4 to 27, that is done. We have this wisdom interlude, the wisdom poem, and then we have, as I've already described to you in the outline, the three great speeches of Job, Elihu, and God that we will need to work through. I wanted to say a word. I think there's time for this. This is really kind of an excursus. This is a thoroughgoing excursus, a rabbit chase thing, but they'll give you a little bit of a mental break. In chapter 28, the analogy again is mining. Mining is a technology. And through technology, people can do amazing things. And I'm using technology in the broadest sense. So building the pyramids is technology. Building a temple of stone is technology. You know, building a supercomputer is technology. Anything people do through skill and craftsmanship, mining, putting together all the instruments you need to dig down into the earth and to find that's human technology. Of itself, it is not bad at all. It's a good thing. It's not wisdom in the second sense. You know, wisdom in the second sense is moral and theological. It's wisdom in the first sense. It's skill, intelligence. So it's not bad, but there's nothing, it's not morally positive either. It can become very negative morally. Not intrinsically, but it can become very negative morally. When you go back to Genesis and the descendants of Cain, what you discover, surprisingly I guess, or not so surprisingly, all of the technological advances are attributed to the descendants of Cain. Music, metalworking, which of course related to mining, these things are attributed to the descendants of Cain, not the descendants of Seth. And then you've come to the great technological feat of Genesis 1 to 11, the building of the tower. Right? Chapter 11, Tower of Babel. And at the episode of the tower, you have all of humanity gathered into one place. And they build this great tower, and the text says the Lord came down to look at it and to see what people had done. And the Lord then says, I'm going to confuse their language. Well, let me get the exact wording. I don't want to get it wrong or paraphrase it. In Genesis 11, you know the story. The Lord comes and he confuses their languages. Verse 7, chapter 11, verse 7. Come, let us go down and confuse their language so that they may not understand one another's speech. I need to go back a verse. I'm sorry. Verse 6. And the Lord said, behold, they are one people. They all have one language. And this is only the beginning of what they will do. And nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language so they may not understand one another's speech. So, what's always been a stumbling block there is, why is God upset at the idea that they would do something great? You know, again, back to verse 6. Nothing that they imagine will be impossible to them. And against the idea of a technological marvel, a wonder. That they might just build all these great wonders. And it's as if God doesn't like that. He doesn't want them to build anything that's too great. Well, is there a danger to the marvel? To the technological marvel, the great work of humanity? Think about humanity at the Tower of Babel. All gathered into one place, all brought together for a single task, all building this great wonder that they will admire that they have made, this great super duper tower. What would be the outcome of that? Well, you know, interesting, idolatry doesn't really come up in the Bible. There's an old Midrashic interpretation, Talmudic interpretation that relates it to idolatry, but there's really no reference to idolatry per se in that text. It's just the tower itself. What is there about the tower itself and all the people being gathered there that is bad? Independence, I think, would be part of it. It's one way of expressing it. Go ahead.
Filling the earth?
Well, they're not filling the earth. That's true. They're all gathered to one place.
They're relying on their own wisdom, not God.
They're relying on their own wisdom. That's true too.
Rivalry with God.
I'm sorry?
Rivalry with God.
Kind of, yeah. Rivalry with God. Go ahead.
They're trying to get to heaven on their own.
Well, it doesn't really say that. It doesn't really say they're trying to, you know, build a tower to heaven so they can jump up there and say, here we are. You know, I'm not sure that's the point. What does it really mean? When people put together a tower, or pyramids, or whatever it is, ziggurat, they say, we are great. We have done this, but in order to do this, we all had to be in one place with one common purpose. So that the technology and their wonder, their marvel, their achievement dominates them so much that they have in effect become enslaved to it. Think about what a society would be like that. All society governed sitting under one great tower. Everybody would be ruled by the one system. Everybody, you know, would be in effect under one, if you want to put it this way, one government. What would happen in that case? It wouldn't be good. It would be tyranny. It would be absolutely being forced to conformity. What if you look at this project and say, well, I don't want to work on the tower? What would they say to you? They'd say, you're going to work on the tower. The ultimate danger is that we look upon our great achievements and what we have to do to make these great achievements, and we essentially become under a tyranny of our own creation. So, you know, you can see examples of both of these things, in my opinion, in the present world or in human history, throughout history. Whenever you have an empire, you know, what do you have? You have the great technological feat, the great wonder, and you have people more and more and more being subdued. So you have, you know, the Egyptian Empire and you have the pyramids. You have the great structures of, let's say, the Roman Empire. You know, all their roads and all their colosseums and all their great and grand structures, and forcing every people into conformity to one government and one ruler, no matter what their native tongue was, you know, no matter where they're from, you know, as the book of Daniel describes it, a mixture of iron and clay. Everybody being forced into conformity into a system that is ultimately tyrannical, right? So I think that's the real danger. It is that every empire seeks to draw everyone into its control, and in that sort of situation, there's going to be no freedom, for example, to worship God. But it holds them together through its technological marvels. And so, again, this is a real excursus from what we have in Proverbs 28, but the point is, there is human skill. And human skill is not of itself a bad thing, but it can become a bad thing. There is moral and theological wisdom, which is very important for us to function well in this life, and there are the inner thoughts of God that are utterly beyond us, and for which the only proper response is to fear God.